Hi, everybody. Welcome to the National Story of Ukraine, Part 5. I think after this lecture, there'll be one more. It'll be Part 6. I've been really enjoying my research into the history of Ukraine. Hope you guys are enjoying these too. Again, there's much more to this story. I recommend Sergei Plotky's The Gates of Europe, which is outstanding. It's the best by far. He's the most acclaimed Ukrainian historian writing in English. He's at Harvard. And speaking of, let's get to him right now. So, uh, critical sources. So, this class is focused currently on Ukraine would not be possible without the scholarship and the talents and artistry of Sergei Plotky. And there he is. He's the professor of Ukraine history at Harvard. He's also director of Harvard's Institute of Ukraine Research. He's won numerous awards for his award-winning histories, and he's written quite a few books. Most importantly for our class, of course, is the one right in front of you, which I showed you guys here a minute ago. Here's my copy. And that's The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine, which came out probably in response, frankly, to what Russia was doing in Crimea in 2014-15 season, the Crimea. And perhaps he's working on it already, but trying to explain to Europe what is taking place, into the world what's taking place in Ukraine. Of course, that book is incredibly timely for the terrible tragedy going through right now, which is Russia's 2022 invasion, ongoing war as we speak of Ukraine. And that story, as you guys know, plays out day by day as all of us are watching this. And its significance for the world and for the people of Ukraine and for people of Eastern Europe and for all of us, frankly. So I highly recommend. You can also find him on YouTube, which I've been listening to him recently on YouTube. He's a tremendous scholar, highly knowledgeable, speaks the languages involved. He speaks Russian, of course. He speaks Ukrainian. I think Polish as well, too, along with English, obviously, maybe some other English as well, too. But a wonderful scholar. And a lot of his class is based on my research into here. And of course, I'll go beyond that, too. I mentioned Timothy Snyder before and his lectures for Yale University and other scholars and historians and even contemporary people talking about what is going on in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Putin, and Zelensky, and all that's taking place there. So I just want to give him credit and recommend for you, those of you guys who are getting curious about Ukraine, I highly recommend picking up that book. It's the best out there by far, not even close. And you guys can dig into much deeper. Along with those other things I mentioned to you, and some more books by Sergei Plotky, The Last Empire, The Final Days of the Soviet Union, The Lost Kingdom, The Quest for the Empire and the Making of the Russian Nation. By the way, Lost Kingdom, if you guys want the history of kind of Russia's imperial enterprise, that book, Lost Kingdom, would be a very good introduction to that topic, because that plays very importantly in Putin and other Russians thinking of Ukraine currently. Especially that title is very evocative, The Lost Kingdom, and their desire for empire. Chernobyl, terrifying topic, but important one, history of a nuclear catastrophe. And then Yalta, The Price of Peace. And you can see Stalin there, Roosevelt and Churchill in the waning days of World War II, discussing the makeup of what post-World War II Europe is going to look like. He's written other books as well. I just put some of his most important there. But I encourage you guys, for those of you guys curious and want to know more about our current contemporary world we live in right now, and a deeper dive into the national story of Ukraine, I recommend The Gates of Europe. Because our class is going to have to move on, as you guys know. So, all right, this class is going to be focused almost entirely on World War II in the Ukraine. If you would ask me years ago about Ukraine history prior to, frankly, the events of the last year, probably like most people in the world, frankly, even many scholars of Eastern Europe, probably the conversation on Ukraine would not have been long because it just wasn't on our radar. Frankly, Eastern Europe tends to fall a bit off of our radar. We tend to be more focused on Western Europe or Central Europe. Think, England, obviously, France, Germany, obviously, Italy, Spain, and have less time understanding of what's going on in Eastern Europe. And particularly you're a nation that's relatively new on the scene as an independent sovereign nation, in this case, Ukraine. But this class and my research for it has dramatically changed that, and obviously the events taking place in Ukraine almost a year ago with Putin's horrific war in Ukraine, invasion of Ukraine, and attempt to destroy the Ukrainian nation, its nationhood, um, and to claim resources and all that for Russia and a rebuilt Russian empire is what has brought this topic to the world's consciousness and ours as well too. So, all right, with that background, let's get into World War II in Ukraine. And I subtitled this, you see, The Devil's Bloody Playground 39 to 45. And that is, boy, that's sadly true. Not that Ukraine had it easy prior to this, as you guys know. And let me highlight this for you guys. Here we go. Okay, there we go. But The Devil's Bloody Playground, yeah, subtitle. And a snapshot of that, and you can see that photograph in front of you guys. Some of the most evocative and chilling photographs of the Holocaust. I should say the early part of the Holocaust. These are the mass killings conducted by these Nazi death units known in history as the Eisengruppen. Many of those photographs are actually from Ukraine. I did not know that until I started researching for this class. I was familiar with some of these photographs, but had not paid attention to their exact location. I knew they were in Eastern Europe, and I thought they were probably in one of the Russian territories. In a sense, I suppose that's true because Ukraine in this time period was under the control of the Soviet Union or Russia. And these horrific, iconic photographs, many of these, which you guys are probably familiar with from other history classes, are actually from Ukraine, including that photograph that you see a mother hugging her child as being shot by an Eisengruppen soldier. And that took place near Ivan-Gorod in Ukraine in 1942. Part of the complicated story, too, is you see this in this case, this being Western Ukraine, and you see a Nazi officer right here, and you see Ukrainian local leaders welcoming there. You can see some Ukrainian girls wearing traditional folk costume, also welcoming these German officers. And you guys know the context of that. The Russian occupation of Ukraine have been very difficult, as you guys know, and based on the previous lecture, not to mention the nightmare of the Holodomor, executions, purges, and what we'll get into here in a few minutes. Sometimes the enemy that's well known, anyone who's an enemy of your enemy, you welcome. And that's an example here of some Ukrainian leaders in Western Ukraine welcoming the German invasion early in the war when the Germans first seized. Now, it turns out the enemy of your enemy will also turn out to be your enemy too, because the German occupation of Ukraine was ferocious. So Ukraine hopes for a liberation at the hands of the Germans are going to be sadly dashed. They replace one evil, tyrannical system with another, as they'll find out. That takes us to Ukraine, contested ground yet again. This whole, as you guys know, Ukraine over and over again has been a contesting ground of greater empires, and Ukrainians caught in the middle of that. Not just losing their nationhood, but also just falling victim to these great power struggles and these competing ideologies. And that is tragically what's going to take place during World War II. They're caught between two nightmares. On the left, you have the totalitarianism of Joseph Stalin. On the left, on the right, you have the fascism, the nightmare that is Adolf Hitler. And Ukraine is going to be in the vice between those two nightmare scenarios. Now let's get into that a little bit. So let's talk about Stalin's views of Ukraine. So what does Stalin think of Ukraine? And we talked about this a bit in the previous lecture. Certainly in the Russian eyes, a very valuable border region, and a place where that Stalin can implement the general goals of industrialization, collectivization, and the Marxist cultural revolution. Let me highlight that for you guys. So now, this is in Russian eyes, I suppose, little Russia, right? But full of very valuable resources. As you guys know, extraordinary farmland, this breadbasket of Europe is there. There's places that certainly can thrive with industrialization, including very large-scale steelworks and coal, etc. And you can see the Azovstal iron and steel works there on the photograph there on the right, which has seen some terrible fighting here in this last in this last year in Putin's invasion of Ukraine, some really savage fighting there. Eventually, the Russians took over that plant after some epic fighting there, almost reminiscent of some of the nightmares Stalingrad in World War II. So Stalin sees Ukraine as a very useful, valuable region of the Russian Empire, also a place where he wants to carry out his experiment on humanity, which is in collectivization and installing the Marxist Cultural Revolution. Now, Stalin also, as you guys know, is fearful of a nationalist, anti-Marxist, disloyal, independent population that he feared also lived in Ukraine. The Holodomor, which we talked about in the previous lecture, is in part, as you guys know, in large measure because of Stalin's fears that Ukrainian peasants and others in leadership are resistant to the communist or Bolshevik revolution, that they're not loyal, that they're looking for some kind of nationalist escape, etc. And he sees them as a problem. And the Holodomor is in part a plan to eliminate that portion of the Ukrainian population that he sees as a disloyal anti-Marxist threat to him, as he perceived it. As World War II looms, Stalin sees Ukraine as likely a target of Hitler, and he's not wrong about that, and moved to try to reinforce and strengthen Ukraine to be a strong border region. He referred to it as a fortress to be able to prevent the German army from penetrating even farther into what is going to be Russia. Let me give you some examples of what Stalin's doing. I mentioned his implementing his industrialization plans. So both Lenin and Stalin believe that technology is vital for communism's ultimate triumph. And specifically, in this case, bring electricity to parts of the countryside that have been neglected and did not have it because of poverty and etc. And so we're going to bring electricity to the entire nation. But this is a progressive part of communism. You can understand that the communists, as they believed, are creating a utopia. Now, it turns out it's a totalitarian system that its long-term economic and human rights abuses are fundamental to what it is. Communism has turned out to be, in its current practice form, since its origin, has turned out to be a disaster. Disaster for human rights, disaster for human life, human morality, and oftentimes long-term economically. But remember that's our contemporary. At the time, though, you certainly had a significant portion of people who are struggling, mired in poverty and so forth, that look at communism extremely favorably and love the possibilities that communism, at least theoretically, appears to be bringing. Equality, into class, into exploitation. It's also going to bring about rapid development. It's going to bring about a utopia of peace long term, into the toxic aspects of nationalism. So on its surface, communism is utopian, and part of that vision Stalin is trying to implement in this case, increasing the economy of the entire area, in this case, practically bringing electricity to the people. So Stalin orders a massive dam built in today what is in Ukraine on the Dnieper River, and it's completed in 1931. When it was completed, it was the largest dam in the world. Now, this is such a huge project, the Russians did not have all the technological know-how to do this. They had to have American technical know-how, which is an irony. But in any case, so with American technical expertise and a lot of Russian labor, and a lot of Ukrainian labor, because Ukrainian peasants are doing most of the labor on this dam. This dam was completed in 1931. Let me show it to you. It was massive. Again, at that time, when completed, the biggest dam in the world. There's a scene of a photograph of a part of the dam being constructed there. I mentioned again part of this, the appeal of communism, and resonate for many Ukrainians too. Appeal of communism is we're going to bring about these radical, massive changes. It's going to improve lives everywhere. And you see a stamp there on the right, a Soviet stamp on the right showing this massive dam and its completion. On the left, you see a stamp commemorating Lenin talking to his followers about what we're going to do. We're going to bring this industrial transformation to the lands who are embracing communism and Marxism. Again, give it a size down. You can see how big it is there in the background. You can see the put into operation and the excitement. And again, it's a showpiece of Stalin's, I guess, a triumph of communism. Look at this massive, massive project we have done. Not only is it going to control the waters, but it's going to bring electricity and power to vast areas. Look at the progress we are making in the eyes of the world, in this case, in the eyes of the Ukrainians. And of course, many Ukrainians would have benefited from this dam. There's no question about that. So again, this is part of the full picture to say that being part of the Russian Empire for some Ukrainians and part of the communist Marxist experiment, at least at the time for some Ukrainians, seems like a wave of the future, the wave of progress, making the world better despite our struggles. Now, subsequently, what happens to this dam during World War II, though, is going to be also illustrate a larger point of the brutality of being in a dictatorship, a totalitarian system run by a communist dictator, in this case, Joseph Stalin. And you'll see that here in just a moment. So during the early days of the German invasion of the Ukraine, the Soviet Union, Soviet authorities under Stalin, and under Stalin certainly orders, decide that in order to slow the German invasion of Ukraine along the Dnieper River, they should blow a hole in the dam and flood the downstream areas with the water being held by the dam in order to slow down the German army. Now, I don't want to say this is unique in history of warfare. There's been plenty of times in human history where dams have been broken or dikes have been breached to inundate fields to slow down enemy invasion. So this is not unique to Stalin. It's not unique to Ukraine to use water as a weapon or a barrier to slow down invading armies. It's happened many times. But my point with that here is not that this breaching of this massive dam is unique in warfare, because it certainly is not. But in the hurry to do this and afraid it would not be done before the Germans got there, the Russian authorities, the commanders, did not notify the downstream Ukrainian population the dam was going to be breached. We don't know how many even died, but tens of thousands of Ukrainians died in the flooding waters that came down from that massive dam who had no warning. I'd like to think in a free country that the people who blew the dam, knowing that ensuing death and destructions could take place, would at least give a brief warning, at the very least, to give people a chance to get out of the way. But I think unquestionably, historians say the Soviet forces who blew the dam were aware that people would not be warned, but they were more worried about Joseph Stalin than they were about the tens of thousands of lives likely lost when they blow the dam. Because if they failed to blow the dam in a timely manner and the Germans seized the dam, they knew that they'd be personally liable and undoubtedly executed. And it gives you the nature of what it's like to be part of a totalitarian system, being the average Ukrainian. That you are not warned because the Russian soldiers who are in charge of blowing the dam are more afraid of the orders of Joseph Stalin and them being executed than they are warning tens of thousands of Ukrainians who live downstream from that dam. We don't know the numbers. I said anywhere from 20 to 100,000 people are believed to have died in the ensuing floods, and these are Ukrainians. More about Stalin, and we didn't talk about this in the previous one, although we could talk about the Holodomor, but the Holodomor was not the end of the bloodletting that Stalin brings to Ukraine. So, now this, by the way, is not specific to Ukraine. It's more specific to being part of Stalin's version of the communist Marxist revolution. So Stalin, starting in 1936, decides that he needs to purge the party, primarily the party. He's already gotten rid of, many of the anti-Bolsheviks already dead or fled or gone. But Stalin decides to purge internally the communist Bolshevik party and proceeds to do this from 1936 to 38. It's called the Great Purge. And this takes place throughout all the areas controlled by the Soviet Union, not just Ukraine. For example, many within traditional Russia, tens of thousands are executed. But Stalin, of course, Ukraine being part of the Soviet system, the Great Purge also arrives in Ukraine too. And the target of this is, and here I want you guys to know this, the target of this is anyone who is in the Communist Party for a long time. For example, old Bolshevik revolutionaries. Let me highlight this for you guys, give you guys a minute to work on that. So anyone that's old Bolshevik revolutionary, any Communist Party official, anyone express any kind of opposition or alternative views, or, and this is a big or, could potentially do so. Or, well, this is an even stranger one, anyone who had a great deal of blood on their hands from earlier purges. They are also gotten rid of in this time period, which seems kind of odd. So, for example, Stalin had his #1 enforcer for the NKVD, who is responsible for many, many deaths from previous purges. He has him purged. So, no one, to make it short and simple, no one within the Communist Party is safe, outside of Stalin, I suppose. His old comrades who were there in the early days of Lenin and Trotsky and the other revolution generations, almost all of them, if they're still alive, nearly all of them are killed. Again, there's some who escape. There's not, I don't want to say all, but many, many of them. And it's not because they're turned against revolution. Now, maybe some are not happy what Stalin's doing to it. Others of them, just for one reason or another, are viewed as being suspect, or since they're there from the earliest days, they could potentially be a suspect because they are old revolutionaries, and they might know Stalin. Like, look, I knew Lenin, and you were not following Lenin's path, or whatever version Stalin might worry that they might say. And he eliminates them. So we're talking massive numbers. The total number of killed, we don't know exactly numbers, but probably anywhere from 700 to 1.2 million throughout the Soviet Union are executed during the Great Purge. In Ukraine, Serhiy Plotky estimates probably 270,000 Ukrainians are arrested, and about half that number executed in 1937 and 38. And that's what I want you guys to know. So we're probably looking around 130 or so, 140,000 Ukrainians who were executed. Many of them, of course, are actually, ironically, Communist Party members, but Ukrainians. Now, there's other people it could be too. You have Catholic priests, others, anyone who Joseph Stalin sees as perhaps politically not aligned to him in lockstep, and that perhaps express any kind of opposition, or just a sense that you could be dangerous or executed. An example of that, you can see there on the left, that photograph. These are relatives of victims of Stalin's purge who are being exhumed for this mass grave. The typical way of execution was a bullet in the back of the head. They didn't typically have elaborate camps for this, although, again, in Russia, you could be sent to the Gulag, of course. But if they decide to execute you, usually it's taken out to someplace and shot. Could be in a prison, shot in a prison, buried in a mass grave, or taken out in the countryside and shot. Depends what the numbers are and what the local NKVD. NKVD is kind of predecessor for the KGB, in case you're wondering. But NKVD is the agency who's doing most of these executions. Now, Ukraine has just gone through the horror of the Holodomor, as you guys know, and also the Stalin's purge. Let's move on to Hitler, the other side of this terrible vice. So Hitler's views in Ukraine. So Hitler, not surprisingly, like all people throughout millennia, have seen Ukraine as very valuable real estate. Obviously, tremendous farmland there, wonderful farmland there. Also many resources, valuable industrial areas, a lot of possibilities there in Ukraine. That's combined with Hitler's obsession with Lebensraum. Lebensraum is living space for Germans. Germany has a large population. German territory is constrained. There's not room to expand anymore unless you do it through military force. Of course, that is Hitler's vision, what they are going to do. And his Lebensraum refers primarily to expanding to the east. Ukraine would be a vital part of that. Now, not just Ukraine, but Ukraine has very valuable farmland. So in Hitler's eyes, that is choice real estate for German colonists to go out post-invasion and settle in these outstanding farming areas and continue the Third Reich into the next millennia. Now, one very important part, you see that, actually let me highlight this for you guys. So if you're taking notes, you might want to write this down. Um, Hitler viewed the Ukrainians as being largely Slavic, which he's correct about that. And why that's important is, in Hitler's eyes, the Slavs are subhuman. So Hitler has no interest in the status or the condition of the current inhabitants of the lands of Ukraine. So he's interested in the geography, the topography, and the potential of the land itself, but not the people living on the land. The people living on the land are simply in the way. And yet, worse than in the way, they're subhumans who we're going to have to deal with. His book, Mein Kampf, which you see depicted there on the left, is where he lays out some of his early philosophy of Lebensraum and moving in his areas for Germany. On the right shows when he was in prison, he's writing this book. By the way, that was one of the... If you're looking to punish Hitler for his time with the beer hall push, putting him into a cozy prison where he has a secretary and a pot of flowers on the table and all that, I'm not sure you're getting the job done, sending the message that Hitler's broken the law. Of course, that is what's happening. This is hardly a prison sentence at all. It gives him time to research and write, and comes out with that very dark vision of humanity, although frankly an honest one. So people who are reading Mein Kampf ahead of time, you can't be surprised what Hitler does after reading Mein Kampf. But he was created during that time period, and the photograph was taken when he was in prison there. So again, Hitler wants to have a place for German settlers, colonists in Ukraine is prime real estate for that. Since the Ukrainians are Slavs, as I mentioned, Hitler views Slavs as an inferior species. And let me highlight all this for you guys. As an inferior species of humanity, clearly you don't want them in part of your future German Reich. You don't want to intermarry with them. You don't want to live next to them. They're simply in the way. You see, Untermensch, the subhumans is how he referred to them. So sooner or later, long term, here we go. Not only are racially inferior, but they're not going to be able to catch up. So long term, we can use them for work. But long term, we have no interest in their survival. So in the short term, we can use them for work and skilled work and so forth. Eventually, we'll exile them, or we can starve them or drive them into extinction at some later date. But his idea of the Slavs was perhaps 2 or 3 generations. The Slavs will be extinct as a subspecies of humanity. And he would emphasize subspecies because they're not racially developed, never will be. The world is better off without them, and the future Reich will not have them anymore at a certain point. Now, in the short run, his plan is not to eliminate them in their entirety in the short run. It's not practical. They need some of them. But long term, Hitler's general view of the Slavs is genocidal. Thank God Hitler lost the war. The Jews and the Gypsies and the homosexuals and Jehovah's Witnesses, which were the first round of Holocaust, that's round 1. Later rounds, the numbers would have got astronomical on the long-term plans of Hitler to racially cleanse the world through his very dark, mythical, fantasy, diabolical thinking when it comes to race and humanity. Now, obviously, and to make things even more, there are many Jews in Ukraine. We'll get to that shortly, but there are many Jews in Ukraine. The Communist Party is well established there in Ukraine as well, too. Quite a few Jews were in the Communist Party. So for both those reasons, Hitler sees the Jews and Bolshevism, and here we go, so-called Jewish Bolshevism as Hitler would perceive it. I'm going to be careful with that term. That's a Germanic or Hitler's perception of Jewish Bolshevism. Imagining that really Bolshevism or Marxism, communism is really a product of Jewish thinking. It's not. Now, were there some prominent Jews in the Bolshevik Revolution? There were. Trotsky is probably the most famous of these. But was communism a Jewish enterprise? No, it was not. In fact, as you guys know, communism is atheistic. There's no place for religion. Not interested in religion. In fact, I think religion is frankly toxic. But in Hitler's thinking, that term Jewish Bolshevism is going to be an important part of how he looks at Jews, at the Soviet Union and Ukraine specifically in context of our class, and viewing this as a contamination. And so it's one more reason when you move into the Ukraine to get rid of many of these people as possible, because they're a threat. They're a threat to fascism. They're a threat to the German racial, long-term development and destiny. And so we got to deal with that. So it's all the more reason when the Germans do invade into Ukraine, the German treatment of the Ukrainians is going to be ferocious, as we'll see shortly. There's a depiction there on the map you see on the left depicting the German, at least in the short run. This is a short run, but short run of where German colonists are going to move into here in Eastern Europe. And you can see Ukraine, all of Ukraine here is part of this Lebensraum, this general plan called General Plan Ost, this view of a wonderful place for German colonists to get settled. Now, there's a little bit complicated here. Even though I mentioned Hitler's long-term plan for the Ukrainians was quite dark, but obviously, if you say that publicly and explicitly, the chance that you get any cooperation from Ukrainians when you invade is nil. So you have other German propagandists saying Hitler is arriving as a liberator. That's that poster on the right saying Adolf Hitler's going to be a liberator. And then based on Stalin's brutal treatment of Ukraine, the Holodomor, the Great Purge, etc., many Ukrainians were very ripe when the German army, to see the German army when they arrived in 1941 as liberators. And that poster is playing into that, frankly, false hope, because you'll see the Germans are not liberators. But at the time, though, there's so much anger and pain from the bloody boot of Stalin on the neck of many Ukrainians that when the German army does arrive, many of them, at least briefly, do see this as a wonderful chance for liberation. A couple more posters there on the left. You see a Nazi propaganda leaflet says, Der Untermensch, the subhuman. And that referred to largely as Slavs. And the post on the left. On the right, again, you see this would be another German anti-Semitic, anti-Soviet propaganda poster. This one actually written in Polish, but saying, look what these Jewish Bolsheviks, communist Russians have done to Poland. But they're thinking to be similar to the Ukraine, even though Poland's a bit north to the west of them, but similar, saying the German army is arriving to liberate. And again, both in Poland and in Ukraine, for some individuals, that might have some resonance of some truth to them. Because, as you guys know, the Soviet occupation of Ukraine and Poland, both, and then subsequent, the Bolshevik attempt to conquer Poland in 1919, 1920, has led some of those people to view Germany as, well, perhaps as a liberator. Less so in Poland, by the way. Less so because Germany is outright invaded, but and Poland was independent, was not controlled by Russia, whereas Ukraine was controlled by Russia. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about Ukraine itself. We've been talking about being caught between the nightmare of totalitarianism, communism under Stalin, and the nightmare fashion under Hitler. So we've been caught between those two kind of poles. All right, but let's talk a little more about what's going on in Ukraine itself. And Ukraine is split. Some Ukrainians in this time period, because it's a complicated situation, there's a wide variety of opinion inside Ukraine itself. Some Ukrainians deeply and desperately want to be free of Soviet control. They more than even, and additionally, they want to have some kind of form of independent Ukraine. You call them nationalists. Now, some of these nationalists, and there's a wide variety of them, but some of them certainly are going to be fascist leaning in this time period. And then we'll see that here in a moment. Other Ukrainians, having been part of the Russian Empire for quite a few years by this time, several hundred years, some Ukrainians have adjusted to that reality and feel that being part of the Soviet communist Bolshevik experiment is the way for the future, and that brings good things to Ukraine. They're on board with the social goals of communism. They're on board with the economic goals of communism and feel that that's the way the world is moving, and we're naturally part of that system, and they've embraced it and are actively members of the Communist Party. But let's give you an example, and that you guys want to know this gentleman. His name is Stepan Bandera. Bandera, there we go. Let's talk about him, and he'll definitely be on the exam. He is a complicated figure to this day. In his lifetime, he's complicated, and to this day, he remains quite complicated. He's a complicated icon of Ukrainian nationalism. Hero to some, villain to others. So who is this guy that he could be a hero to some, and that's in Ukraine, not just internationally, but even in Ukraine, he has very mixed feelings of Ukrainian people thinking about him. Now, he was a radical nationalist. Radical nationalist is well, maybe we won't go into the details, but radical nationalist is an extreme form of nationalism. He certainly was a fascist. He's also a freedom fighter, but you could also depend on how you view him, a terrorist. He's involved in planning assassinations. He certainly was anti-Semitic. He's a Nazi collaborator. He's also anti-communist. That's a lot in one person. He's complicated. That is him there on the left in 1934. That's him as a young boy wearing a folklorist costume. I'm trying to figure out what the expression is on his face there, and I don't know. I don't know if he's ready for that photograph. I don't know if he's upset. I don't know what that look is. But the fact that he's dressed, holding a rifle, looking like a Ukrainian Cossack is evocative of what we talked about, several lectures back of many Ukrainians looking back at the Cossack age as an age of a very admirable, heroic time period in Ukrainian history of Ukrainians attempting to hold on to their nationhood, their freedom, the rejection of hierarchy, rejection of foreign tyranny over them, and a great pride in being independent, egalitarian, and bringing back those memories. So as a young boy, him wearing that costume was reflective of the Ukrainian desires. And then on the right, you can see a relatively recent series of postage stamps released by the Ukrainian government celebrating the centennial of his birth. Let's get into this complicated individual a little deeper. So he was a Ukrainian far-right nationalist leader of the militant wing of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists named OUNB. It's a fascist organization. Let me highlight this for you guys. What does this organization want? They want Ukrainian independence. Irredentism, which is a fancy word, simply means any lands that Ukrainians historically believe is part of theirs should be brought back into a new independent Ukraine. So basically reclaiming any lands been carved off by Poland or by Russia. Anyone who's taken lands that are seen as a core part of Ukrainian nationhood. In an independent new Ukraine, those lands that have been carved off on the edges need to be re-brought into the Ukrainian state. I mentioned he's a fascist. He's anti-liberal. He's not interested in liberal aspects of democracy, individual rights, democracy. That's not the way he views. I think he has no time for that. Feels that's a weak system. He's strongly anti-communist, despised communism, and was friendly with fascist governments, to say the least. At a very young age, being a nationalist, he joins the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. He's quite talented, rapidly rises in the leadership, even though he's a young man, and is involved in an assassination plot against a Polish minister who would be assassinated, and later also involved in an assassination plot against a Soviet diplomat in revenge for the Ukrainian deaths in the Holodomor. This is what people view him as a terrorist, is quick to use violence and not apologetic. As a radical nationalist, as a fascist, violence is a tool, not apologetic about it at all. We'll use it when we need to. We'll come back to that here shortly. The Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, is focused on Ukrainian independence and reclaiming lost lands, and they also are quick to use violence, as I mentioned. The OUN is anti-communist, anti-liberal. And it's anti-Semitic. This was especially strong in Western Ukraine, not Eastern, but Western Ukraine. Galicia, for example, but Western Ukraine is where this organization is strongest. Now, eventually, the Polish authorities tracked down Banatyra, who, remember, he was involved in the assassination of the Polish minister. They eventually catch him, try him. He initially given the death sentence, but they did commute it to life in prison. But in the chaos of the German invasion of Poland, in that chaos, the prisons are opened and Banatyra is able to escape and rapidly returns to Ukraine to return to working with his organization with hopes that perhaps a window of opportunity is opening for Ukrainian independence and this chaos that's coming with the start of World War II. Russia, by the way, had not invaded, Germany had not invaded Ukraine yet. But Banditera feels that that's coming, that's likely to happen. He begins to secretly collaborate with Nazi intelligence. Let me highlight that for you guys. To aid a Nazi invasion of the Ukraine. Now, why is he doing this? Not because he wants the Nazis in control. He wants the Ukrainian fascists in control. But Nazi fascists are cousins in a sense, ideologically, certainly. He hates the Russian control, and so views opportunity of a Nazi invasion of the Ukraine, of Russia, as being a window of opportunity to allow the Ukrainians to have a nationhood. And you saw this back with the previous lecture when the Germans took control of Ukraine in 1918. That's when the Ukrainian state, in that same time period, was attempting to be born, and briefly was born, right? Remember, you had that brief window of time when there was an independent Ukraine in 1918, 1919. Now that will be crushed and reabsorbed into the Soviet Union under the Bolshevik regime. But that brief window of opportunity posed by the German invasion occupation created the opportunity of Ukrainian independence briefly. And the Germans in 1918 were okay with that. They were not focused on Ukraine. If Ukraine could be independent and supply the German army with grain in the waning days of World War I, fantastic. Now, we don't know how that would have played out long term because Germany, shortly the war ended and the Bolsheviks resumed the war against Ukraine independent state, and Ukraine independent state in that terrible civil war is eventually going to be crushed. That's all background to what Bandera is attempting to do. But his collaboration with German authorities is quite brief because, as you guys know, Hitler has no use for the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians are hoping the German invasion means liberation for them. What means the Russians are kicked out doesn't mean that. It does not mean liberation. And the Germans are not interested in the Ukrainian state. Remember, they use the Ukrainians as Slavs, as subhumans. So the Germans have no interest in that. Or I should say, Hitler certainly had no interest, and the German leadership primarily has no interest in. So quickly see Banditera, who wanted an independent Ukrainian nation, as a problem. He's arrested by the Nazi authorities, and he's thrown into Sachsenhausen. I'm sure that's not quite right for the German there. But he's thrown into a German concentration camp. Well, to let you know how what the Germans thought about the Ukrainians. This guy is a fascist, aligned in many ways with, at least in general, with the fascist policies of the Nazi Party. He's anti-Semitic, has other issues that we quite similarly aligned with the Germans, but he's Ukrainian, and he wants a Ukrainian independent state. The Nazis are not interested in an independent Ukrainian state, not interested in Ukrainians as a people at all, as you guys know. And so he simply is in the way, and so the Germans rapidly make an enemy of him as they throw him into a concentration camp. Now, amazingly, he would survive the war, but clearly he realizes both the Nazis and the communists, as he sees, are both enemies of Ukrainian nationhood. Survives the war, amazingly. Eventually will go to West Germany and he'd support the anti-Soviet Ukrainian insurgent army, which I want you guys to know. Kind of forgotten part of history right there. Who actually continue fighting Russian control. Even after World War II has ended, the Ukrainian insurgent army would fight the Russians all the way to the 1950s. Because of this partisan guerrilla war taking place, the Ukrainian insurgent army, even though the Russian army controls all of Ukraine, but the Ukrainian insurgent army is not happy with that. They don't want the Russians back, as you guys know. And so they continue to have guerrilla operations and fighting against the Russians as guerrillas all the way in the 1950s. And Stefan Banditera is supporting this, even though he was not there. He's in West Germany. But he continues to support the struggle, being a leader in the far-right party. So much so that eventually the Russian agents see this as an ongoing threat to their control. They track down Banditera and they assassinate him in 1959. Again, for many Ukrainians looking back on this, they see him as a martyr for Ukrainian nationhood who was assassinated by the Russians or the communists. So, let's get the summary here. To this day, Banditera's legacy and memory incites strong reactions to Ukrainians and beyond. So, and here we go. To his companions, champions, not companions, champions. That's a typo. There we go. That's better. To his champions, he's a national. Okay. To his champions to this day in Ukraine, he remains a model of a brave, tireless, martyred liberation fighter who remains a hero for his strong, lifelong battle, ultimate death for the purpose of Ukrainian independence. So to this day, he has heroes I'll show you here in a minute. Now, other Ukrainians view him as a fascist, which he was, as a Nazi collaborator, which he was until he got arrested and thrown in a concentration camp, and a man responsible for killing many Poles and Jews. Again, there's a lot in this lecture we get into, but during World War II, there's some terrible violence between Ukrainian nationalists and Poles who are living in disputed territory that's claimed both by Poland and by Ukraine. And there have been very savage fighting during World War I between Ukrainians and Poles that reemerged in the chaos of World War II, even under German occupation, where you had Ukrainian nationalists trying to eliminate Poles from certain areas, especially in Western Ukraine, areas that were contested between Poland and Ukraine. And there are some terrible massacres of Poles in Ukrainian territory. And Ukrainian nationalists oftentimes are the ones who are driving those massacres, and that's connected to Bandera, even though he was not there at the time. But his philosophy, though, is partly responsible for that. It's kind of hard to see this photograph if you look carefully here on the left. Let me scroll down here. You'll see that Bandera's OUN and Nazi officials, a joint celebration describing Ukrainian statehood, and that took place in July 7, ironically, close to our Independence Day, 1941. You can see the Nazi officials blurred kind of darkly right here. Now, again, that went nowhere. Maybe they had that celebration a couple of days later. I don't know, 3 days later, but rapidly after that, Bandera is arrested. So that brief attempt at the Germans as liberators and providing opportunity to be independent, that's going to evaporate. That's a depiction of massacred Poles there in Volhynia, who've been massacred by these Ukrainian nationalists. Again, Bandera was not, he would have been in a concentration camp that took place, but his organization, his philosophy would be in part what's leading to that. That's why some Ukrainians today, especially Jews, look at him very negatively, saying you're responsible for killing Poles and also some of the anti-Jewish massacres that took place later on too. But again, he's a hero for many Ukrainians. You can see that that's a Stefan Bandera monument in the far west of Ukraine today. That's him right there. That's his face there on that flag right there. You can see flags. By the way, these other flags are also right-wing national organizations currently in Ukraine, where he remains a hero. To some, villain to other Ukrainians. So again, he's a very controversial figure currently in Ukraine. Just depends where you fall on the political spectrum, what you think about him. Now, that's a little piece of the nationalist side to Ukraine, looking for independence, anti-communist. Now, there are plenty of Ukrainians who have made peace or even embraced Marxism and communism and think that Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which is how the Soviet Union referred to Ukraine specifically, that's simply part of this larger Bolshevik communist experiment, and are glad to be part of that. And certainly many Ukrainians do join this and are actively involved. I think this is the way of the future. It's reality. During World War II, many of the Russian soldiers in Ukraine, not surprisingly, are actually Ukrainian. You shouldn't be surprised if that's the case, but that is the case. So there's millions of soldiers who we deployed, Soviet soldiers who were deployed in Ukraine, defending Ukraine, later on involved in the terrible fighting there, and ultimately liberate Ukraine from Nazi control. Many of those, into the millions, would be Ukrainian young men who are in the Red Army. Some of them conscripted, forced in the army, others of them happy to defend their homeland, happy to be and proud to be part of the Red Army. You can see an example of that here on the right. You can see this is a Red Army a monument recalling the victory in World War II over fascism, over the Nazis. But that monument, this photograph has been taken in the last year or so, because you can see the head of one of those Red Army soldiers has been knocked off. This is because the current feelings in Ukraine are not so positive to the Red Army for obvious reasons taking place currently as we speak. But again, that's in the future. So for many Ukrainians, Ukraine is a part now of Russia. They're part of, formerly used term Little Russia, now we're part of larger Russia. And you had some very prominent figures in recent Soviet history who were born in Ukraine and became leaders of the Soviet Union. The most famous of these by far would be Nikita Khrushchev, who you see depicted here right above here. There's Khrushchev right there. Nikita Khrushchev, born in Ukraine. So, ancestry Ukrainian. Now, obviously, he becomes an important Soviet leader, and Leonid Brezhnev, who's there on the right as a young man, Brezhnev becomes one of the last leaders of the Soviet Union. I remember him as a kid. See him in the news. Brezhnev, also born in Ukraine. And obviously, for them, Ukraine is part of the larger Soviet Union. It's the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic. So they're part of the larger structure of the communist experiment and part of Russia. And that's how they would have viewed themselves. All right, let's get to the war itself. And I want to try to get done here shortly. But the German invasion of the Soviet Union. So the Barbarossa, this terrible war that takes place as Hitler decides to grab that Lebensraum by invading Russia and the Soviet Union. That being June 1941, the German armies advanced rapidly into the vast spaces of the Soviet Union and far across Ukraine. These photographs are from Ukraine. Those are German officers in a captured ironworks. I'm guessing probably perhaps in the Donbass today is where they are right there. And show you Soviet, looks like anti-tank crew defending Odessa, Ukraine early in the war. I want you guys to know this battle. We'll do it very briefly, but Sevastopol is an incredibly important port, both then and now and historically. And Sevastopol is in the Crimean Peninsula. Let me show you the map right here. Sevastopol is right here. A very important port there. Wanted by many nations, by the way, historically, and it's currently right now. The Germans won it. Soviets put a lot of work into defending it, and that led to a nightmarish, incredibly intense, massive battle for control of Sevastopol from 1941 to 42, as the Germans are besieging this heavily defended Russian port. The Russians definitely want to hold on to it. Leads to an epic and bloody battle. Very heavy casualties on both the German and Red Army side. Many of the Red Army soldiers and Russian civilians, Ukrainian civilians, of course, are killed in this terrible fighting there. Eventually, after extraordinary effort and incredibly intense bombardment, the Germans are able to eventually seize Sevastopol. But in the eyes of Russians and in the eyes of many Ukrainians, the brave resistance against this German siege of Sevastopol has entered into the hallowed halls of national memory of defeating fascism and slowing down them, even though the Germans eventually win that battle, but the battle slowed the German invasion of Russia down. You can see a massive railroad gun there on the left. Actually, the biggest gun ever used in modern combat was used there in Sevastopol as the Germans are shelling these Soviet fortifications around the port city of Sevastopol. Photograph of some Russian sailors there defending Sevastopol. Some of the terrible results of the fighting there. You see badly injured Russian and Ukrainian citizens there and soldiers there. Ultimately, Hitler's forces will prevail there, but they are slowed down from the invasion of the larger Soviet Union. So the sacrifice there is recalled with a lot of pride in Russia and among some Ukrainians for slowing down this German assault on the Soviet Union and Ukraine specifically. An example of that, I want you guys to know this. So in Russian national memory, again, some Ukrainians too, there's a strong attachment to the Crimean Peninsula and Sevastopol itself because of the extraordinary amount of blood shed to defend that city. Not just in World War II. A little farther back in history, we've not talked about this in class, but the Crimea War, which some of you, if you're a history major, you might be familiar with it. But the Crimea War also took place there, obviously in the Crimea. And there's heavy fighting on Sevastopol. And this painting, this heroic painting showing Russian defenders of Sevastopol from the Crimea War in the 1850s is illustrative of what I was talking about, which is Russian attachment to the Russian Empire, frankly, of what Crimea forms a part. Recently, there's a movie that came out called The Battle for Sevastopol. Maybe you guys can find it on Netflix or Amazon. I haven't looked for myself, but I'm thinking about it. About a female Russian sniper who had a lot of combat time there in Sevastopol. By the way, that's based on a real person. I'm I'm sure the movie might be like all kind of Hollywood or Russian Hollywood versions. There are probably some Hollywoodish parts to it, but it's based on an actual person. And that movie is recent, came out in 2015. And again, hero essentially of Sevastopol fighting against the Nazi fascist tentacles, which are seizing control of parts of the Soviet Union in the eyes of Russians. You see Vladimir Putin laying a wreath there in Sevastopol. That was back in 2000, way back, I suppose in better days in some ways. All right. But that's important to understand the context of Russian attachment to the Crimean Peninsula specifically. Now, Ukrainians have their own story to tell, of course, right? So we don't want to give all that airtime just to the Russian version of that. Ukrainians say that's been historically a part of Ukraine for millennia. So yes, Russia has fought epically 2 great battles there, but that does not change its status as part of historical Ukrainian homeland. We were incorporated into the Russian Empire against our will. So the fact that you had great battles on our territory, we understand that, but that does not give you a right of ownership to them. All right, we'll move on to the last topic here, and that is a very sad one, which is the Holocaust in Ukraine. And I want you guys to know the context for this, and actually maybe I'm going to stop this lecture right here, and we'll have a follow-on. So, because I don't want to make this lecture any longer than it is right here. So we'll get to the Pale settlement, but that'll be with the next lecture to follow on. So we'll pick up with that the next one. So that's enough for now. So take care, everybody.